At 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, April 4th, at 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, April 4th, Lincoln set forth on his historic journey to Richmond. When the Malvern reached the channel approaching the city, its passage was blocked by wreckage of all sorts, including dead horses, broken ordnance, wrecked boats, and floating torpedoes. They were forced to transfer to the captain's barge, which was towed in behind a little tug manned by Marines. This is April 4th, 1865. A little tug manned by Marines. When the tug went aground, the president's arrival was left to the rowing skills of a dozen sailors. The situation was unnerving to Crook on either side. He recalled, "We passed so close to torpedoes that we could have put out our hands and touched them. Here we were in a solitary boat." Admiral Porter remembered, after having set out with a number of vessels, flying flags at every mast head, hoping to enter the conquered capital in a manner befitting the rank of the President of the United States. Lincoln was not disturbed in the slightest. The situation reminded him, he cheerfully noted, of a man who had approached him seeking a high position as a consulate minister. Finding he could not get that, he came down to some more modest position. Finally, he asked to be made a tide waiter. When he saw he could not get that, he asked me for an old pair of trousers. But it was well to be humble. No sooner had the presidential party reached the landing than Lincoln was surrounded by a small group of black laborers shouting, "Bless the Lord! There is the great Messiah! Glory, hallelujah!" First one and then several others fell on their knees. "Don't kneel to me," Lincoln said, his voice full of emotion. "That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy." The men stood up, joined hands, and began to sing a hymn. The streets, which had been entirely deserted, became suddenly alive with crowds of black folks tumbling and shouting from over the hills and from the waterside. An ever-growing crowd trailed Lincoln as he walked up the street. It was a warm day, Admiral Porter noted, and Lincoln, whose tall figure overtopped every man there, was easily visible. From the windows of the houses along the 2-mile route, hundreds of white faces looked on with curiosity at the lanky figure walking with his usual long, careless stride and looking about with an interested air and taking in everything. Lincoln's bodyguard was relieved when they finally reached the safety of General Weitzel's headquarters, for he thought he had glimpsed a figure in Confederate uniform pointing a gun at Lincoln from a window along the route. Weitzel and his officers had occupied the stucco mansion that Jefferson Davis had abandoned only 2 days earlier. Captain Barnes recalled that when Lincoln walked into the comfortably furnished office of the Confederate president, he crossed the room to the easy chair and sank down in it. To all present, it seemed a supreme moment, but Lincoln betrayed no sense of exultation or triumph. His first words, softly spoken, were simply to ask for a glass of water. The water was promptly supplied, along with a bottle of whiskey. An old black servant, still at his post, told them that Mrs. Davis had ordered him to have the house in good condition for the Yankees. Lincoln had already toured the mansion, seeming interested in everything, and had met with the members of General Weitzel's staff when the Confederate Assistant Secretary of War, John Campbell, arrived to see him. Lincoln welcomed Campbell, whom he had met 2 months earlier at the Hampton Roads Conference. While the details of their conversation were later disputed, it appears that Abraham Lincoln, still fearing that Robert E. Lee might engage in a final battle, agreed to allow the Virginia legislature to convene on the understanding that they would repeal the order of secession and remove the state's troops from the war. Riding through the city that afternoon in an open carriage, the president and his entourage found the Confederate State House in dreadful disorder. Signs of a sudden and unexpected flight. Members' tables were upset. Bales of Confederate strip were lying about the floor, and many official documents of some value were scattered about. When they finally returned to the flagship, Both Admiral Porter and William Crook were greatly relieved. Having worried all day about Lincoln's safety, Crook later wrote that it was nothing short of miraculous that some attempt on Lincoln's life was not made. It is to the everlasting glory of the South that he was permitted to come and go in peace. As Lincoln rested on the Malvern that night, all the public buildings in the nation's capital were illuminated. By order of the Secretary of State, the city was all alight with rockets, fireworks, and illuminations of every description, observed Noah Brooks. The streets being one blaze of glory, it seemed the entire population of Washington had poured into the streets to share in the triumph and view the brilliant spectacle produced by thousands of lighted candles. Though Seward joined in the glorious celebrations, he continued to fret. The following day, he told Wells that he had secured a revenue cutter to take him to Richmond with some important papers that required the president's immediate attention. He is filled with anxiety to see the president, Wells recorded in his diary, and these schemes are his apology. Minutes after taking leave of Wells, Seward nearly lost his life in a carriage accident. Fanny and her friend Mary Titus had come to the department to join her father and brother Fred for their customary afternoon ride. As the horses moved up Vermont Avenue, the coachman stopped to close the carriage door, which had not been properly latched. Before he could return to his seat, the horses bolted, swinging the driver by the reins as one would swing a cat by the tail. Both Fred and Seward jumped out, hoping they could stop the runaway horses. Fred was not hurt, but Seward caught his heel on the carriage as he jumped and landed violently on the pavement, causing him to lose consciousness. The horses tore along, Fanny recorded in her diary, and we seemed to be whirling on to certain destruction. At an alley they turned. We brushed against a tree and headed straight toward the corner of a house where she feared she would be crushed to death. Fortunately, a passing soldier got control of the reins and brought an end to the terrifying ride. Rushing back to the place where her father had fallen, Fanny was horrified to find his broken body, blood streaming from his mouth. At first, she feared he was dead. For 2 hours after he was carried to his home, Seward remained unconscious. When he came to at last, he was delirious with pain, having suffered a broken jaw and a badly dislocated shoulder. Doctors arrived, and Fanny could hear his agonized cries through the bedroom door. When she was finally allowed to see him, he was so disfigured by bruises that he had scarcely a trace of resemblance to himself. Damn! Hearing the news, Stanton rushed to Seward's bedside, where Fanny recalled he was like a woman in the sick room. He ministered carefully to his friend, perhaps remembering childhood days when he had accompanied his father on sick calls. He wiped his lips where the blood had caked, gently spoke to him, and remained by his side for hours. Returning to the War Department, Stanton sent Lincoln a telegram at City Point. Mr. Seward was thrown from his carriage, his shoulder bone at the head of the joint broken off, his head and face much bruised, and he is, in my opinion, dangerously injured. I think your presence here is needed. Receiving the message shortly before midnight, Lincoln advised Grant that Seward's accident necessitated his return to Washington. Meanwhile, Mary and her invited guests, including James Speed, Elizabeth Keckley, Charles Sumner, Senator Harlan, and the Marquis de Chambrun, were steaming towards City Point. At dawn the next morning, Mary sent a telegram to Stanton. If Mr. Seward is not too severely injured, cannot the president remain until we arrive at City Point? By this time, the Surgeon General had determined that Seward had suffered no internal injuries. Stanton informed Mary that there was no objection to the president remaining at City Point. A few hours later, he sent word to Lincoln that Seward was recovering. I have seen him and read him all the news. His mind is clear and his spirits are good.